Before I share my story with you, I need to let you know that I'm here as a private individual on my own time. My opinions are my own and not those of the Southern California Association of Governments, or SCAG, or our funding agencies. So, I'm an environmental economist by training, and I have been thinking a lot about resilience for a while, especially in the context of climate change. Resilience is a term that often gets thrown around a lot, and it can mean many things. We can be talking about resilience at a personal level, like I just did, as the ability to adapt and to overcome an obstacle or stressful situation. Or we can also think about resilience at a larger scale. And for this, I'd like to actually borrow a variation of the definition of resilience that we recently adopted at SCAG, at the Southern California Association of Governments. And that's that resilience is a community's capacity to anticipate and respond to changing conditions, shocks, and stressors by creating opportunities for sustainable, thriving, and an equitable future. And the story I wanted to tell you about is an example of where I saw this. Actually, we all saw this example recently. And so, as you must recall, a couple weeks ago, California was hit with the worst heat wave in our history. All 40 million of us here in the Golden State were running our air conditioners and letting the fans run all day and doing everything we could to cool off. I live at the beach, and when it gets hot in Southern California, people escape the heat to come here to cool off. During this heat wave, it was 90 degrees at the beach. There was no cooling off here. And usually when we have hot, wet temperatures, the cooler nighttime temperatures offer us a reprieve from the daytime temperatures, but not this heat wave. We were pounded with a tsunami of heat all day and for many days. So not surprisingly, the resulting surge in demand for electricity put record-breaking stress on our electrical grid, threatening rolling blackouts throughout the state. And blackouts aren't just an inconvenience to us, that we can't charge our phones, or we can't charge our cars when we want to, or we can't run the dishwasher when it's full. So blackouts aren't just a headache for politicians. Blackouts threaten life and health, and they threaten life and health, especially for our most vulnerable residents. Now, not to keep picking on Texas here, but we could have toughed it out like they did in Texas last winter and let the outages roll. Or we could have just said, kind of like Texas, and say, well, let the market take care of it. Instead, we took collective action to help everyone avoid the blackouts. And so what happened was, when the blackouts were imminent, the California electric grid operator, or known as CAISO, sent text alerts asking Californians to voluntarily reduce their electricity use during the critical hours. And it turns out we acted as a community and we avoided those blackouts. So that's what I call being resilient. We built that structure of resilience, and we were able to avoid these blackouts that could potentially harm a lot of people, besides Mr. Newsom. Anyway, so this isn't the first time that California faced an overheated grid. So, if many of you might recall, in 2020, we did have some rolling blackouts in response to extreme heat. But we've learned and applied some of these lessons. And as the effects of climate change intensify, we will continue to face risks to our electrical grid and also to other infrastructure. And we will likely endure blackouts. We will endure road closures, backups in the ports in the future, and extreme weather events. So how will we build resilience so that we can adapt to these changes and build sustainable and thriving communities? And so I'd like to offer us a three-pronged approach. One is having a plan and some clear objectives, the way we did in response to this heat wave. And the second key point of my approach is to have an understanding of the facts, have an understanding of the science underlying the changes that we've triggered in our environment, and also understanding the impacts of our plan. And then the third point, which I think is actually the most important point here, is taking a collective and community approach to our response to climate change. We can't do resilience alone. And I want to focus on that a little bit. I'm a pro-market economist, and I recognize, like maybe some of the people in Texas, that a well-behaving market does a great job of making sure that people get what they want and what they need with minimal waste. That's what we call efficiency. Um, and by well-behaving markets, I mean markets that have no market power, where there's complete information, there are no externalities. In other words, markets where individual incentives are aligned with society's needs. However, I also recognize the limitations of markets. When markets are not well-behaving, markets actually encourage fragility and rather than resilience. So when we're addressing both the mitigation of climate change and adaptation of climate change, markets are far, far from well-behaving. And with respect to adaptation of climate change, which is the focus of my story, is that markets will produce too little adaptation because individual incentives are misaligned with the needs of society as a whole. So to build resilience, to be able to adapt, for communities to adapt to climate change, we will need not only to take a collective action through government policy, but also in our local communities. And I think Elena's story about her conversation with this mom in Texas is what I'm talking about, is talking to each other and talking to our local communities. And local communities need to work together to figure out, they need to collaborate rather than compete, to figure out what is the best adaptation strategy for them and for their children and for our future generations. And every community is going to have different needs, different perspectives, different ways of looking at the world, and they're going to have different constraints. And I think where we as voters, as members of this society, we need to encourage our governments to take an active role in assuring that these local communities have a voice at the table, that we're having those conversations so that we can be more resilient and not encourage a fragile system that does not allow us to adapt to the realities of climate change.